Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education, and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with four members of our podcast team: production coordinator Jazzmin Chizu Gota, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, editor Elizabeth Schwab, and former communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbrueggen. In this episode, Jazzmin, Sabrina, Elizabeth, and Jessica discuss the origins of their interest in human rights issues, how they learned about and became involved with HRE USA, and their roles and activities in bringing human rights education now from concept to publication. Well, it's really a great pleasure to speak with the people who make this podcast function. And I need to give a little background before we start our dialogue, because in 2023, we began publishing Human Rights Education Now in February of that year. But as anyone knows who is involved in a project, it takes time to build it. And I can honestly say that when we started with the concept of this podcast, we didn't have a single idea of what we were getting into, other than looking at what other people had done. So we've built this from the ground up, and it's been a very interesting and I think a really exploratory process along the way. So this interview is with the people who have made it happen. And yours truly is the host, but I'm simply a voice. The people who make it happen are the following, and they're all on this discussion right now. And that's Jazzmin Chizu Gota, Elizabeth Schwab, Sabrina Sanchez, and Jessica Terbrueggen. And they're going to each tell you about what they do on the podcast. But along the way, they have a very interesting set of personal histories to share, along with their interest in work in human rights education. So thank you all for being here tonight. And let me start by asking each of you, what inspired you to become interested in human rights, and specifically in human rights education? So I'm going to ask Jazzmin to begin.
Great. I think formally it was in graduate school, first from the perspective of cultural anthropology, and then through my first class in human rights education with Dr. Susan Katz and her human rights education, pedagogy, and praxis class.
Okay, let's move on to Elizabeth.
Yeah, so my first exposure to human rights was actually in college. I took a human rights and humanities elective course my freshman year, and we learned about Bryan Stevenson and climate justice, and I read the UDHR in entirety for the first time, and that really inspired me to get involved in human rights in general. It kind of shifted my entire career towards that, and I would say more specifically human rights education, because I was so inspired by the class myself that I wanted other students, whether in high school or in college, to have a similar experience and to learn about the same principles and values that I myself was inspired by.
Sabrina, how about you?
I can't recall a profound moment when I can say that was my introduction to human rights and or interest. I think as a child growing up along the border, I didn't have that language. But in middle school, they kept on using social impact as a way to draw middle schoolers to do volunteerships with the school-led organizations. And ever since that, I think if I were to go back, I'm like, that was definitely human rights related work, because you were educating people about conservation, about taking care of one another, about peace building. And similar to what Jasmine and Elizabeth said, I think formally, my introduction to human rights wasn't up until my college years, my bachelor and my undergraduate years. That was when the language was more formalized and there were mechanisms in place, right? And so that's what I latched onto, and reflecting a little bit, I'm like, oh, this has been within my life since a very long time ago. So yeah, formerly undergrad at SFSU and then at USF with the International Multicultural Education Master's Program with the human rights emphasis. So yeah, I think that sums it up.
And Jessica,
I have to say I'm in the same camp with Elizabeth and Jasmine with grad school. Like when I first took a human rights education course with Felissa Tibbetts, that was just what sparked my imagination. It was just, I was like, oh my God, there's a whole field dedicated to this alone. And so it was pretty fascinating to me. And I found a really great intersection with it in relationship to where my background, where I'd been coming from in literature. And like, in literature, we're always examining like the human condition and like, there's these weighty things brought up in these texts. And then I found this other real intersecting idea of human rights education that just kind of blew me away. And I was just like, poof, from there, I just kind of didn't stop. So
now each of you have, I think, fascinating personal histories that reveal a lot about your values, I think, and your principles. So I'd like anybody of any of you four to talk about what you think might have been a personal event or a personal episode that you think highlights your commitment to human rights or human rights education.
So after that class I took my freshman year, it really sparked my interest in human rights. And it was kind of at the back of my mind. And then that summer, I was volunteering with St. Francis House in Boston at a soup kitchen and also taking a class at the same time about like social justice and ethics in Boston and then also larger like US context. And one day we had a guest speaker come in who was wrongfully convicted for over 10 years. And she was talking about her experience. And with her on the same panel was a lawyer from the Boston College Law School who came over to our campus and talked about how she helped exonerate her. And I think that conversation for me really catapulted my career in human rights activism specifically. I got involved in the Boston College Law Innocence Project that helped exonerate her the next semester because I was so inspired. And that kind of continued into my work here at HRUSA, where I met Christy. So I would say like hearing her speak in that classroom definitely inspired me.
Jasmine, I've read your background and it's fascinating, your connection to your ancestors in Japan, and then also your life in the United States and your interesting background in the arts. Can you talk about something that you feel was sort of transformational for you?
When I was fairly young, I learned a lot of in depth about my family's experiences during World War II in concentration camps in the United States for persons of Japanese ancestry. And then from there, I started learning more about the larger context of World War II. And I really wanted to know what are the mechanisms that and the dynamics that can cause an event like that. So I started looking at like discrimination. I started looking at issues. I started, and then I really started looking at propaganda. And then sometime in the middle of that, September 11th, 2001, and I started seeing some of the same mechanisms. So discrimination of a different group, similar acute event. And I just wanted to really kind of understand why and why so many people might accept that. Because these were clearly both illegal. Some of them, well, some of the actions were illegal, some of the actions were just immoral. And I just really wanted to know how those dynamics work with like news media and with propaganda. And from there, I ended up in a I ended up getting sent to a program by my mom who did not want me to become a full-time activist for art and design. So I ended up doing a lot of learning about digital arts. I learned a lot of software. But in that program, I also kept wanting to come back to my question. And so I ended up doing a lot more research than I actually did design work. So after college, I really wanted to go back to grad school. And after one failed attempt for one program, I ended up at USF. And so from there, I actually did my master's thesis project on that topic that I'd been kind of mulling around since I was like 10 or 11. And now I am a doctoral student in human rights education at USF on a slightly different subject, but it's kind of that's where my research trajectory came from, was just that first question of why and how, and what are there interventions that could be designed to keep it from happening over and over and over again.
Great. Sabrina, how about yourself?
I always go back to my hometown and how unique it is since it's on the border of South Central Texas and Mexico. And growing up, there's been a lot of kind of love-hate relationship with the dynamics down at the border. And we've all seen in media some pretty violent and disturbing acts of like inhumaneness, right? With immigration and with like gangs, etc. But growing up, I think I remember like in the late 80s and bleeding into the early 90s, the Reagan administration was such a pivotal political era in Texas. And, you know, when we think about the skyrocketing rates of, you know, femicide in Mexico and Central America and the increase of illegal drugs into the US, we have to pause and think about the role of the US. And I think, again, once I received the knowledge and the factual information to be able to use a cause and effect analysis and understand position and privilege, I always think about the Reagan administration for me, at least when I was born in the 80s. And then additionally, being in Texas and being a woman, once I was interested in needing access to reproductive health care. That was really challenging. And I know that there were many friends and families, members who were unable to access, you know, free of shame and with care and with kindness, just access to contraception. So that has been really pivotal and one of the reasons why I don't reside in Texas at the moment. And so I think those two moments, immigration and reproductive right, women reproductive rights are really strong for me. And that has ultimately also inspired and motivated me to conduct research, accessibility research, you know, primary and secondary across these regions that have very harsh restriction laws around those two areas of focus. So those are two pretty pivotal examples for me.
Thanks. Now, Jess, how about yourself?
I don't really know a pivotal moment. I mean, I was scrolling back through my head and I think I've just always been one of those people who just had like so much empathy that it was painful. Like I remember being a little kid and, you know, going to visit my mom downtown at her office where she worked. And there, you know, there's a lot of homelessness. And my mom was always terrified for me because I would literally, you know, I would take a homeless person, put him in my car for a minute, buy them lunch. And my mom would come out and be like, "Oh my God, what are you doing? You know, you can't put these people in your car." But I just never saw it that way. I thought this is a person in need. You know, so just from a very young age, it just, all of that inequity, you know, it just never felt right. And it always tugged on me in a deeply emotional way. Yeah, I can just think back to being super young and just not being okay with all of the injustice or inequality and wanting to just deeply do something, even if it was let someone come take a shower, or whatever, it just, so I don't know. I can't think of like this critical moment. I think it's just always been inside of me in that way.
I think all of your experiences point to the idea that you see connections between yourself and other people. And by doing that, you believe that your life is related to them, not necessarily as a family directly, but as the larger family of humanity. And I think that's something that comes across very clearly, but very powerfully, I think, too. So let's turn to the podcast itself. Now, each of you have been involved with Human Rights Educators USA. So what I'm going to ask you to do is tell us first how you connected to Human Rights Educators USA, and then describe what you do on the podcast, because this shouldn't be a great mystery to anyone, but we need to make it clear, transparent. Now, how did this happen? And what did you do? And what are you doing? So I'm going to start with Elizabeth.
Yeah, so my journey also started my sophomore year of college. And I was at an event with my scholarship program here at Boston College, the Gabelli Presidential Scholars, and I met a BC alumni named Tony Fernandez, who is now working for the Department of State and was at the time. And he was talking about his work in human rights and international development. And at this moment in time, a lot of these ideas were percolating in my head, and I was thinking about getting more involved with human rights. So I went up to him after and I said, I'm really interested in human rights. How do I get into the field? And he pointed me to Christy, who I met with shortly after, and she kind of took me in as a mentee. And I remember I sat in on the first podcast meeting just to learn about what it was and what HRE USA was. And after that, I started to get more involved in the organization itself. So I started out on the podcast team, and I self-taught myself how to edit the different audios and the interviews, did a lot of experimentation on what works, what doesn't, and I have been doing that since then. So I am the editor currently, and I've taken on a couple of other roles in HRE USA too, on the steering committee and the executive committee as well. But yeah, that's kind of my journey in a nutshell.
And for our audience, perhaps we should just outline the process that Elizabeth just is part of the process, and Sabrina and Jessica and Jazzmin will all talk about that. But let me briefly go through it. That we conduct an interview, and I do the interview, and then that interview has to be edited and produced. And Elizabeth just talked about how she works as an editor. Well, she gets the original audio and then divides it into 2 segments. She then integrates introductions and closings. And that's only part of the process, but that's sort of where she's involved. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sabrina, and she's going to talk about her role.
It's like a little game of relay, virtual relay, this podcast. It really is. It's kind of fun. Okay, so on paper, my title is sound designer and project manager. In action, that means also attending these meetings, but once I get the baton that material has been finalized and ready, I do a one quick over, just a quick review, and then I update the Buzzsprout podcast page by uploading the podcast, the file, the audio file, and then adding the text and the topics, which were created before me, a little bit of Jess and Elizabeth. So I update the Buzzsprout podcast page, and then I also update the HRE USA website on WordPress. So that involves a lot of communication with everybody, especially with the comms team, because we want to try to be as in sync and aligned with when it really goes live. And so there's a lot of communication and coordination that happens on the back end to ensure that that happens, because it has to be in sync with blog and emails and other kind of external public outreach and engagement. So that's my role. And then just to quickly answer the first question about how I even figured out that HRE USA existed. It was in 2012, which was my first year of grad school at USF. And I want to say it was Susan Katz or Shabnam, and I might have mispronounced that name, but A couple of people in my class during that year mentioned HRUSA, and I hopped on board right away. So I've had various roles throughout the last, Jesus Christ, 13 years. So I'll stop there.
Well, and I think, let me just add that Sabrina has a huge amount of technical expertise, and I think this project would not have functioned without that. She's too modest to say it, but I'm not. And so part of the job we had to do was to find a host and be able to have a platform. And we chose Buzzsprout, but that's only the first step. Sabrina then navigated the whole thing and figured out how we would make it work. So that's an important dimension of this that many people don't understand. Okay, Jessica, you're next.
Okay, well, I had just kind of come on board with HRE USA. I had met Christy in, I think, was it Philadelphia, I think, at a conference there, and then got hooked up with her. And then like very shortly after that, I was kind of looking around, at the different projects going on. And I remember reaching out to Jazzmin and just saying, "Oh my gosh, you're working on this podcast," and I just felt compelled to be a part of it. I just said, well, I just want to like do something with that because that's super cool. And it's new and it's like great. And it's like, a really effective way to get, ideas out there to people. And it just seemed exciting and fun. So I know Jazzmin just really quickly like hooked me up in email with everybody and said like, oh my gosh, like, what can Jess do? And I really had no idea what to do, but I think, I helped at least for the time being to fill the need of trying to do, kind of that promo material side of it. And so everybody else would do all of the heavy lifting. And then I would get like I would get Bill's type up after all the heavy work had been done and just kind of fit it all into a nice document and use Jazzmin's wonderful template for the imagery promo stuff and kind of just really do the light lifting of getting that together and then like, kind of push it on out so that it could go to the newsletter and, all the other outlets and go on social media. So that's about what I did. That's how I got there and what I was doing.
So there's one piece that I need to explain that Jessica referred to, and that is the list that she referred that I prepared. So as the host, after I've done an interview and I've sent Elizabeth the material for the episodes, once she does the production of the episodes before they're published, I then go in and I identify what are called topics by time. So you might say the first minute or two is the introduction and closing, then whatever the speaker's talking about, the next part. And we go through the entire interview, and that's published along with the material Jessica has created so that there's a text component as well as an audio component, and the text component goes on the website. And I'll say it again, when we started this, we didn't know what we were doing. And so this has all evolved. And so now I'm going to turn it to our designer, Jazzmin. Tell us your role and how it works.
Right. I'm going to try to remember how this. I remember first hearing about setting up the podcast. And I remember a few conversations about how to promote it in the e-newsletter. So I'm the editor for the e-newsletter for HRUSA. And from there, I'm going to throw in like, I also am team on the light lifting side. Like there is so much that goes into this. And I feel like I've just kind of like, if there's like, sometimes it's technical things, sometimes it's setting up templates or design elements because my background's in multimedia design. But mostly support. Like I feel like my role has primarily been in support wherever it is needed at the moment. But yeah, full credit to the editing group and the writing up of all of the keywords and the moments in the podcast. Like it's a huge amount of work. So how did I get up? How did I become connected to HRUSA? First, I remember it was Susan's class. It was fall 2013, and she handed out papers to the whole class and let everybody know that we should probably join. And I ran into one of the co-regional representatives for Northern California at a conference in 2019 while she was planning on stepping out of that role, and we kind of swapped. So I've been technically part of HRUSA since 2013. I haven't really been super active since I started in 2019.
I want to add one thing to what has been brought up so far, and that is something that Sabrina did for us. It's our logo, because she didn't design it, but she found the designer. How did that happen, Sabrina?
I was just thinking about that. I was thinking about the logo. So I am a part of another human rights, a global remote-based human rights organization called Human Rights Connected. So they are a key resource with anything human rights and civil resistance related. So as soon as we were embarking on this journey, I was like, I'm going to ask them to see if they know of any artists or designers with a strong human rights presence that's creative and kind of just fits the ethos of HRUSA. So kudos to them. I reached out, one of my colleagues, Matt, I'll give him a little shout out. He connected me with a human rights activist who he's been in contact with and has a working relationship. So we kind of just kickstarted the conversation. I shared more about HRUSA and kind of our vibe and our style, and they really delivered. I think we are really fortunate that it only took one try to find a logo that resonated well with the organization and with us, and there was no hassles, and we were on a time crunch. So yeah, very grateful. Also that we had the financial capacity to pay them, because that's a huge key element as well. And I think the logo is really sweet. So that's awesome that we've been able to use it and implement it in a lot of our outreach.
And there's one other dimension of this that we haven't talked about yet. I'll just mention it, is that we had to have music. So I took it upon myself to look on the internet for copyright-free music that we could use. And then what we did was we sent about 5 samples out and everybody voted. And the one you hear is the one that this group chose. So it's important, too, to recognize that any interview that we do, including the one we're having tonight, is essentially the owner of that interview before they sign off is the individual. And so every person receives a form from me, it's called a release, which allows them to say, well, there are certain conditions I might want to set on this. For example, I might want to hear it before it's published or so forth, or I want a transcript. But they sign off, and that's returned to HRUSA, which grants HRUSA the rights to use it and publish it. So I think part of the job of our whole team has been to sort of monitor how we go about what we do and to make sure we're sticking to high standards. And I'll just tell you a brief thing before we go back to another question, and that is the license that we employ from that allows us to publish is interesting, because what it really says is it allows us to publish, but it also doesn't allow anybody to change anything. And I think that's an important issue right now, particularly when so much content is available across so many domains. It's important that what we publish doesn't get altered. And that's a very significant issue. Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next program concludes our conversation with podcast team members Jazzmin Chizu Gota, Sabrina Sanchez, Elizabeth Schwab, and Jessica Terbrueggen. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HREUSA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI at hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tia Hins, and production coordinator Jazzmin Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.